Hi, I'm Sean Munger, historian, teacher, and YouTuber. Most of you who are regular viewers of this channel probably know by now that I'm offering a class on my website, seanmunger.com, called The Origins of 9/11, which is exactly what it says on the tin, a deep dive into where the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001 came from, why they happened, and why they matter. The class is very in-depth, much more so than I could do even in one of my long deep dives here on free YouTube. It's more academic and analytically focused. There are 57 video chapters and a lot of side material. The class is pricey, I understand, and the price does cut some people out. So what I decided to do was to present 3 of those video chapters here on my channel for free. This is both, so those of you who might be interested in the course can get a taste of what you'll be getting, and also to showcase some of the content for those of you who are not able to take the course for whatever reason. One of the chapters presented here is specifically about the conspiracy theories involving September 11th and why they are not true. That in particular is a subject that many of the viewers of this channel have asked me to tackle. Now, it's not a full, in-depth debunking like my 2 video series from 2022 on the Kennedy assassination, but it's at least a taste of the material that I've done on it. Now, the conspiracy theories are not the main focus of the course, far from it. In fact, it's only 1 chapter out of 57 that even deals with it, but I put it here for what it's worth. That'll be the 3rd of the 3 takes I present here. The first of the course chapters I'm showing here, Lesson 15, is about the founding of Al-Qaeda in 1988. The second, Lesson 22, is on Ramzi Yousef, a terrorist tangentially connected with bin Laden, who is an important personality in the background of 9/11, even though he did not take part in the attacks themselves. Then finally is Lesson 53 on the conspiracy theories. Keep in mind that the style of the class is very different than what I do here on my public-facing channel. The lessons are less visually flashy and more academically oriented. The class is not just a larger version of what I do here on this channel. It is qualitatively different than that. If you're interested in the class, there's a link in the description and here in this video to sign up to get on the waiting list. There are only 50 slots in the initial offering of the class, and I've had way more than 50 people interested, so space is pretty limited. But if you don't make it into the first round, I will be offering another round of registration in a couple more weeks or months. The class launches on November 11th, and the day before that, on November 10th, registration officially opens. If you get on the list, you'll get an email on that day that will tell you how to register, if you're ready. I realize this video isn't for everyone. That's fine. If you're not interested in the class, well, you know what I'm going to say. I'll be back with another deep dive video here on my public-facing channel in a few weeks. But for what it's worth, here are 3 chapters on 3 wildly different aspects of the very complicated subject of September 11th. The actual organization known as Al-Qaeda was not founded until 1988, but it had ancestors and predecessors that go way back before that. In the early 1980s, as you know, Osama bin Laden was persuaded by his spiritual mentor, Abdullah Azzam, to set up a financial organization in Pakistan to send aid to the Afghan Mujahideen. That organization was called the Maktab al-Khidamat, or MAK. I mentioned that in Lesson 7. The MAK was originally mainly about finance, but eventually it morphed into the seed of the private army that bin Laden took into Afghanistan in 1987 to actually fight the Soviets on the ground alongside the Mujahideen. A year earlier, in 1986, bin Laden had moved more or less full-time to Peshawar to organize this junket. This is where he met Ayman al-Zawahiri, who had come to Peshawar to run a medical clinic to help Afghan refugees and injured Mujahideen. It was in that place, Peshawar, and that period, 1986 to 87, that most of the major characters we've been talking about converged. In addition to bin Laden and al-Zawahiri, various members of the Egyptian Islamists were there. So was Omar Abdel Rahman, the blind sheikh who would later be involved in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, and Abdul Rasul Sayyaf, a Mujahideen warlord whose secretary and close confidant was a young man called Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who would go on to plan the 9/11 attacks. As I mentioned in an earlier lesson, bin Laden's record as a military commander against the Soviets was decidedly mixed. And the actual Afghans who were fighting the Soviets regarded him as sort of an interloper, basically a tourist with a couple of guns. He wasn't a very key part of the resistance movement. In any event, bin Laden and his men got into the fight pretty late. By 1987, Gorbachev was already looking for a way out of the Afghan war, and by the next year there was a timetable for Soviet withdrawal. This sent the Arab Afghans into crisis. With the war ending in about a year, what were they going to do? Just pack up and go home? The real Afghans certainly wanted them to, but bin Laden and the others had bigger ideas. What if they could take the army they'd built to fight in Afghanistan and turn it into sort of an all-purpose jihad army that they could take anywhere in the world to fight for Islam and against its perceived enemies? This was an idea that all three of the major brains behind the organization, bin Laden, Abdullah Azzam, and al-Zawahiri, liked. However, a split developed over two basic concepts. The first was what such a permanent jihad army should prioritize in accomplishing. Al-Zawahiri and the Egyptians, consistent with their background, thought that job number one should be to complete the Islamist conquest of Egypt that they'd been trying to achieve for years. Bin Laden, however, thought they should take the fight to the next enemy, the United States, and the Jews, meaning Israel. Yet at the same time, bin Laden expressly did not want to get his private army involved in the Intifada, the uprising of Palestinians against Israel in the occupied territories, which was then going on. Bin Laden hated Yasser Arafat, a secularist, and he didn't want to get co-opted by him. This put bin Laden at odds with Abdullah Azzam, who very much did want to get into the Palestinian fight. Azzam didn't like Arafat either, and he didn't plan to be subordinate to him, but he did want to train fighters in Pakistan or Afghanistan and send them to Palestine to kill Jews. The fighters he wanted to train would come from Hamas, which had recently been founded in Palestine. The second split was over the theological concept of takfir. You may recall I mentioned that earlier. It's a complicated concept, but basically it was about whether it was acceptable for a Muslim to treat other Muslims as excommunicates for not being true enough to Islam, which would, if the answer was yes, make it okay to kill them in the name of defending Islam. I won't go through all the theological debates, but it shouldn't surprise you that the men who founded Al-Qaeda decided yes on the takfir question. It is true, however, that they didn't really begin to put it into practice until much later. It was finally tested in Al-Qaeda's first terrorist attack that would kill fellow Muslims in late 1992. I'm going to mention that in Lesson 19. By May 1988, bin Laden, probably intending to make an end run around the others who disagreed with his approach, quietly started organizing his new permanent jihad army. He asked a few of the men who'd fought with him in Afghanistan to join him. This was all happening in Peshawar, by the way, across the Afghan border. A few months later, in August, after some squabbling, the bigwigs sat down for a formal meeting to work out their differences. The meeting occurred on August 11th, 1988, and this was the formal beginning of Al-Qaeda, which meant the base, that is, of the new Islamic society they wanted to build. An important thing happened at this meeting. Because he was the one who had actually led troops into battle, and also because he had a lot of money back in Saudi Arabia, de facto leadership of the new group passed to Osama bin Laden, rather than Abdullah Azzam, whose idea this thing mostly was. Because Osama was now the leader, that meant his priorities for Al-Qaeda would eventually win out. The new army would focus on jihad against the West and not get involved in the Palestinian struggle. Not long after this, incidentally, Abdullah Azzam was sidelined from leadership in most of the activities he'd founded. It was a dispute about money. He essentially broke with bin Laden over this and also over the concept of takfir, which Azzam did not believe in. Also, Azzam was deeply chagrined over the outbreak of squabbling between the Mujahideen factions after the Soviets left. In any event, Azzam was assassinated in Peshawar in late 1989. Al-Zawahiri was suspected of being behind it, but there's no proof of that. Although bin Laden was in charge, the rift between him and the Egyptians, al-Zawahiri and the men who surrounded him, was never fully solved. It was just sort of papered over. Al-Zawahiri was never able to change the fundamental direction of Al-Qaeda, and as a result, bin Laden's organization did not commit itself to his major goal, which was the Islamist conquest of Egypt. Al-Qaeda set up shop in a place called Abbottabad, a suburb of Peshawar, Pakistan. It was a professional organization with a constitution, bylaws, and committees. Young men could join the organization formally if they swore allegiance to bin Laden, and they would receive a salary, the equivalent of about $1,000 a month. Al-Qaeda even had a health care plan. The demographic that bin Laden targeted as potential recruits consisted of young men from around the Islamic world who were unemployed, hopefully as a result of having quit their education or careers to go fight jihad in Afghanistan or later Chechnya. In this, Al-Qaeda has significant similarities with various other nefarious organizations throughout history who have sought to recruit angry young unemployed men, like Mussolini's Fascisti in Italy or the Nazi Party in Germany after World War I. Is it fair to compare Al-Qaeda to fascism? I'm going to leave that determination up to you, but I will give you a tool to do so. I've linked on the page for this lesson a famous article from 1995 written by Italian academic and author Umberto Eco, an essay usually called Ur-Fascism, in which he sets out 14 characteristics of fascist ideology. If you read it and go down the list, I think you'll see that Al-Qaeda fits every single one of them. Personally, I believe Al-Qaeda is a fascist organization, but read Eco's essay and make your own determination. In addition to a terrorist organization and a job and a form of fascism, you could also describe Al-Qaeda as a cult. Lawrence Wright, the author of The Looming Tower, which is the source that I keep returning to, he specializes in writing about cults. His next most famous book after this one, Going Clear, is an analysis of the cult of Scientology. Also linked on this page, it's a PDF download, is another article, a paper by cult expert Stephen Hassan, which sets out what's called the BITE model. That's a conceptual model for recognizing authoritarian mind and behavioral control. This is an analysis you'll want to undertake if you really want to get so far deep into the weeds that no one will ever find you. And Hassan's paper is 158 pages. But if you choose to accept that impossible mission, I think you'll see that there's at least a colorable argument that Al-Qaeda does fit the BITE model and thus qualifies as an authoritarian cult. These are digressions. Sticking to the basic historical story, Al-Qaeda as an organization is now in existence. We're going to leave the subjects of Osama bin Laden and Afghanistan for a while and take care of some other contextual business. But hold in your mind everything that we've learned in this chapter. It's very important. We are now in Unit 3, called Al-Qaeda Rising. In this unit, we'll be looking at how bin Laden's network of terrorists eventually attained the leading role in the Islamist struggle against the West, and how they came to position themselves to commit the 9/11 attacks. The first subject we need to tackle is a profile of a particular terrorist, Ramzi Yousef. His actual name was Abdul Basit Mahmoud Abdul Karim, and he was born in Kuwait in 1968, a contemporary of lead 9/11 hijacker Mohammed Atta. Ramzi Yousef's parents were Pakistani, and throughout his life he maintained close ties with Pakistan. Yousef's family is important. His mother is the sister of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the man who conceived of the 9/11 attacks and brought the idea to bin Laden. The question of whether Ramzi Yousef counts as a member of Al-Qaeda is a contentious one. Bin Laden claimed to have never met him, and that claim was probably true. Yousef was not a member of Al-Qaeda in the sense that he owed political allegiance to bin Laden and was what you might call a card-carrying member. I think it's more accurate to call him Al-Qaeda adjacent. He and bin Laden's organization came out of the same milieu. It is sometimes claimed that Ramzi Yousef trained in an Al-Qaeda terrorist training camp in Pakistan. That claim is also somewhat true, but somewhat not. It's hard to know exactly. A lot of this has to do with what was going on in Pakistan during and after the Soviet-Afghan War. In Pakistan, there was an ecosystem of support structures for Mujahideen fighters. This consisted of funding organizations like Islamic charities, supply bases, and pipelines for weapons and money, and actual terrorist training camps. Although the material surrounding Ramzi Yousef is extremely confusing, I think the best way to characterize it is to say that he came out of this same ecosystem of terrorist support in Pakistan, which eventually came to be dominated by Al-Qaeda. But Yousef sort of moved through and out of that system before bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were really the major players within it. After they were, as Yousef's terrorist career continued, he naturally had significant dealings with Al-Qaeda. Ramzi Yousef was a militant Islamist. Do you remember this guy, Sheikh Abdullah Yusuf Azzam, who popped up in Lesson 7? Azzam was one of bin Laden's major influences, and during the Soviet-Afghan War, he operated several of those support networks to the Mujahideen fighters. Although Azzam was assassinated in 1989, some of the support network organizations he founded eventually morphed into Al-Qaeda. One of Azzam's close associates and good friends was Omar Abdel Rahman, also often known as the Blind Sheikh. He had been a mover and shaker in various Islamist organizations in Egypt, and as such had rubbed shoulders with al-Zawahiri. Well, Rahman eventually went to the United States in 1990. There he preached jihad, the necessity for Muslims to kill Americans, particularly Jews. All these guys were blistering anti-Semites. Ramzi Yousef was a huge fan of Omar Abdel Rahman. He believed entirely in his program and was ready and willing to carry it out. Ramzi Yousef also dreamed big. In that terrorist training camp in 1991, Yousef learned about electronics and especially how to build bombs, really big bombs. It was also there in that camp that Yousef met another terrorist, Ahmed Mohammed Ajaj. The two of them traveled to New York at the end of August 1992. They were not the most subtle in their approach and were caught by customs authorities. They had with them various fake and altered passports from several Middle Eastern countries, some literature about bomb making, and a manual whose title included the words Al-Qaeda, the base, although that term had not yet been applied as the name of an actual group at the time the manual was written. Long story short, Ajaj was put in prison after his Pakistani passport was revoked. Yousef was let go, mainly because customs didn't have the time or resources to detain and investigate him. Yousef began communicating with people in Rahman's orbit. Rahman was living in New Jersey at this time. And Yousef began planning a major bomb attack against the target he himself selected, the World Trade Center. I'm going to talk about that in the next lesson. Again, the key thing about Ramzi Yousef, though not technically Al-Qaeda, he came out of the same milieu as bin Laden and Al-Qaeda did, moved in the same orbits as people close to bin Laden, and definitely shared the same radical ideology. Though not ordered by bin Laden or anyone else to do so, Ramzi Yousef was the first Islamist terrorist to take it upon himself to attack the United States directly on its home soil. That, of course, was the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, which is the subject of the next lesson. This next section is a bit of an outlier and kind of a disruption of our larger story. The purpose of this overall presentation is not to debunk conspiracy theories about the September 11th attacks, which have been roundly refuted over and over and over again for over 20 years now. I have, however, been asked about this specific topic so often that in covering material related to 9/11 in general, if I left it out, I would get asked about it even more often. So this chapter is sort of preemptive in nature. In a way, this entire class is an indirect debunking of 9/11 conspiracy theories. The traditional conspiracist claims about the events are based, and I mean really and truly based, on ignorance. Most 9/11 truthers, as they're known, don't deal with Al-Qaeda at all, and virtually all truthers, it's been my experience, know nothing substantive about them, or about Osama bin Laden personally, or about any of the broader strategic reasons for the attack. Most conspiracy theorists simply dismiss the whole idea of Al-Qaeda as a fabrication or as irrelevant. One claim I recall reading online years ago was that Al-Qaeda didn't really exist because the words Al-Qaeda in Arabic supposedly mean the toilet, and no terrorist group would name itself after a toilet. Ignorance, pure ignorance. As you know, the words Al-Qaeda mean the base, and the evidence both for the group's existence and its responsibility for September 11th is overwhelming and irrefutable. Conspiracy theorists also often claim that bin Laden was a CIA agent. Everyone a conspiracy theorist doesn't like, including me, is accused of being a CIA agent. As we know from an in-depth analysis of bin Laden's history, ideology, and strategy thinking in this class, bin Laden was clearly not a CIA agent. Years ago, I made a YouTube video on this exact topic. I'll link it on the page for this lesson. The charge that bin Laden was a CIA agent is a lazy conclusion jump from, and indeed a total misrepresentation of the fact that the United States funded the Afghan resistance, the Mujahideen, during the 1980s Soviet-Afghan War, and bin Laden was on the side of the Mujahideen. As we've seen, the Afghans generally regarded bin Laden as an interloper. They usually resented his presence, and so he was not really one of them. But in any event, since bin Laden had his own money, there would have been no need to take funds from Americans. There is no evidence, simply none, that bin Laden was a CIA asset. It's just not true. So, just to dip a toe into some of the major conspiracy theories, probably the central one is the idea of controlled demolition, that the World Trade Center towers were not brought down by the impacts of the planes or the damage they caused, but rather by explosives that had previously been placed in the buildings by persons unknown. The whole idea is nonsensical, and it falls apart at even the slightest logical inquiry. First off, if the towers were wired to explode, even assuming such a thing could have been possible, which it isn't, why would the conspirators, whoever they were, have used airplanes to strike them? That would add a whole layer of complexity to the plot that's needless and in fact dangerous in the sense of it'd be much harder to coordinate and much easier for the plot to have been discovered. As you know, the 1993 World Trade Center bombing was done with a truck bomb, and it almost worked. The only reason it didn't collapse the towers was because the terrorists couldn't get enough explosives on site. The planes used in the 9/11 strike were designed to overcome that obstacle. Because they were almost fully loaded with fuel, they were basically flying bombs. No need to try to get explosives on site. The hijacked airliners would deliver the explosives themselves. If the whole thing was ginned up and faked, why would the conspirators have gone to the extra time, expense, and risk to add the hijacked planes to the scheme? Why not just tell everybody it was a bigger truck bomb that had been used back in '93? The only time I've ever heard a 9/11 truther address this issue, the answer was typically idiotic. The conspirators must have done it this way, he said, because it would be so much more dramatic on TV than if the towers just blew up. Well, that idea is obviously dumb. It means the conspirators assumed that if the scenario just looked like a truck bomb, it wouldn't be quote-unquote dramatic enough to gin up public outrage to justify whatever it was they were trying to justify. But the presence of planes in the plot would make the difference between success and failure. That clearly makes no sense whatsoever. Some particularly delusional conspiracy theorists contend that there were no planes at all, that they were holographic projections of some kind. That's nonsense. During the making of this project, I spoke to an eyewitness who actually saw the plane strikes with his own eyes, not on TV or on video. There were literally tens of thousands of such eyewitnesses all over New York. The planes undoubtedly existed. To contend otherwise, you will also have to explain what happened to the passengers aboard them. Controlled demolition makes no sense as a practical and technical matter. Where were the explosives placed? Who put them there? And how could they have done it while the World Trade Center towers were open for business and full of tens of thousands of people working there? Yes, even on weekends. You don't think that people would have noticed strange workmen coming through the building all day hauling packs of explosives? It would have taken weeks, if not months, to get enough explosives in place. No one found them during the weeks they were there before 9/11. No random floor cleaner or maintenance man happened to notice a single bundle of explosives strapped to a girder or something? Not once? Where did these explosives come from if they existed? Who paid for them? How did they get them on site? Where were the delivery trucks? Who drove those trucks? Where's the paper trail? How come in 23 years no one has come forward or implicated anyone else in planting them? Not a single witness, a single whistleblower, a single shred of evidence? A very silly theory that was floated about the year 2006, the heyday of 9/11 truth as a thing, mostly online, contended that the World Trade Center towers were treated with paint made of thermite. Yes, you heard that right, exploding paint. The whole idea is so impossible and so ludicrous, it's scarcely worth mentioning. Nevertheless, there is no evidence that the towers received a new paint job, explosive or otherwise, in the weeks or months before 9/11. An even dumber idea came at about the same time from an actual engineer who contended that the World Trade Center towers were disintegrated with some sort of beam weapon, for which there is no evidence, and which has apparently never been used again anywhere on Earth in the 23 years since 9/11. Some have speculated that this beam must have been fired from space. So yeah, those are your two major theories about controlled demolition, exploding paint and space beams. We're not dealing with exactly the most rational ideas here. Many believers in 9/11 conspiracy theories claim to have disbelieved what they call the official story, meaning the truth, because of the way the World Trade Center towers looked on TV when they collapsed. These claims took a lot of different forms, with catchphrases attached to them, like free fall speed, which is, of course, nonsense. But any theory based on denial of the reality of how the towers collapsed springs from a lack of understanding of how the World Trade Center towers were constructed to begin with. Despite their appearance, they were not solid monolithic blocks that could be expected to retain structural integrity after major disruption. Indeed, the walls were more like curtains hung from a fairly fragile frame, or a tower of Jenga blocks, rather than actual monolithic objects. I will not show images of the towers collapsing in this video. There are plenty of them online. But architecturally, once the carefully designed stresses of the load-bearing elements of just a couple of the top floors at each tower were compromised, their progressive collapse, floor by floor in a downward pancake fashion, was inevitable. This was established by an exhaustive, thousands pages long report by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, completed in 2005. Another common trope of 9/11 conspiracy lore, repeated so often that it's basically a meme, is the idea that jet fuel doesn't burn hot enough to melt steel beams. That is, like everything else, a nonsense argument. The structural elements on the top floors of the towers didn't melt, they were weakened, which occurs at a much lower temperature. But in any event, there was a lot more burning at the sites of the plane strikes than jet fuel, such as wood, paper, fiberglass, plastic, everything that was in the towers. The violence of the plane strikes knocked aside enough of the fireproof insulation that covered many of the structural beams in the Trade Center and exposed their cores to high temperatures that key sections of the upper floors were damaged. Not only is this well understood now, but it was anticipated even before the attack by bin Laden himself. On a tape recovered by U.S. forces from a house in Kandahar, Afghanistan in November 2001, bin Laden told Zawahiri the following, quote, "Due to the nature of my work, I figured that the fuel in the plane would raise the temperature in the steel to the point that it becomes red and almost loses its properties." End quote. The work he refers to here is construction and engineering. 9/11 truthers in their heyday were fond of pointing out the collapse of World Trade Center Building 7, a neighboring skyscraper that collapsed later on the afternoon of September 11th, after burning for many hours. In fact, truthers were so confident that this somehow proves a shadowy conspiracy that they used to claim it as a kind of trump card or smoking gun. Google Building 7 was a common phrase you would see on the internet in the late 2000s. This argument also proceeds from ignorance of the facts. When the main Trade Center towers collapsed, the shock wave severely damaged most of the buildings in the immediate radius of the Trade Center site, blowing out their windows or shattering them with debris. Of these collateral damages, Building 7 was the most badly hit, with several noticeable chunks taken out of its lower exterior structure as a result of being hit by debris from the main Trade Center collapse. The damage also caused fires that raged uncontrolled for hours throughout the whole building. Engineers on site knew Building 7 was going to collapse hours before it did. It was inevitable, and in all the chaos, there wasn't much they could do to prevent it. When it did finally collapse at 5:21 p.m. on September 11th, nothing could have been less surprising. The Pentagon was also a target on 9/11, and a popular conspiracy theory in the early days was that the Pentagon wasn't hit by a plane, but rather some sort of missile, though who supposedly fired it and from where, the conspiracy theorists never explain. The theory is, as are all the other ones, nonsense. Hundreds of witnesses saw American Airlines Flight 77 strike the Pentagon, and extensive debris from the plane was recovered. And again, as with the holographic planes nonsense, if this didn't happen, then what happened to Flight 77's passengers? Another common trope of 9/11 trutherism was that the phone calls made from United Flight 93, the flight brought down after the passengers fought back against the terrorists, were impossible or somehow faked, the usual claim being that cell phone calls couldn't reach the ground. First of all, that's false. Cell phone calls could reach the ground and did, but secondly, most of the calls made by passengers on Flight 93 reporting on what was going on were from airphones, specifically designed onboard telephones that were common on planes of that era. A surprising claim that all 9/11 truthers seemed to agree on in the years after the attack was the bizarre suggestion that the hijackers are still alive. It's surprising because it's uncommonly moronic, even for 9/11 truth theories, and also because of how easily it's disproven. All of the hijackers still alive claims, every single one of them, stem from a single source, an online article run by the BBC on September 23, 2001, which was then picked up by another British news source. The news story was about how authorities investigating 9/11 discovered various men with the same names as hijackers on the 9/11 flights, Walid al-Shehri, for example. In fact, the story was clearly about the process of the FBI tracking down men with the same names as the hijackers to eliminate them as having had anything to do with 9/11, meaning they were narrowing their search down to people who had those names who were really the 9/11 hijackers. It is as common in the Arab world for people to have exactly the same names as it is common in the English-speaking world. I've known two different guys in my life named Stephen Burke, both spelled the same way. How unusual is that? Not very. If any of the actual 19 Al-Qaeda operatives who hijacked planes on 9/11 were actually alive after the attacks, why wouldn't a reporter have tracked them down and told the world about them? Indeed, why wouldn't 9/11 truthers themselves be motivated to find these guys, supposedly alive and well, and parade them in front of the world press to prove the official story was wrong? In 23 years, no one has done that. Furthermore, the parents and families of the 9/11 hijackers have all accepted that their sons and relatives are dead. Some, such as the father of Mohammed Atta, have declared their children to be righteous martyrs in the fight against American imperialism. The final claim I'll deal with here is what seems on the surface to be a slightly more reasonable conspiracy theory than the exploding paint space beams and holographic planes stuff asserted by most 9/11 truthers. This is the idea that, in fact, Al-Qaeda did do it, but the Bush administration knew they were going to do it and deliberately did nothing to stop it. This is known in conspiracy circles as LIHOP, an acronym, let it happen on purpose, rather than MIHOP, made it happen on purpose. If you think about it though, let it happen on purpose is in reality an even crazier and stupider conspiracy theory than made it happen on purpose. Assume for the sake of argument that someone in the US government got a tip-off, fully formed and actionable, that Al-Qaeda was going to strike at exactly 8:48 a.m. on September 11th, by crashing a plane into the World Trade Center. How would the person who received that tip know who else also might have received it? How could they know and trust that whoever else might have known about it could be counted on not to alert the FBI, CIA, NYPD, or CNN that was going to happen? Even if it was Bush himself who received the tip, first of all, who would tell him directly anyway and why? How could he be so certain that no one else knew about it, or that whoever else did know about it would keep quiet? All anyone who changed their mind would have to do would be to blow the whistle and then implicate Bush in the cover-up. The LIHOP theory assumes that the conspirators who knew, first of all, could keep total control over that information and could also count on the loyalty of everyone else who knew it. This is totally unlike the way government secrets work in real life, including something as big as the Manhattan Project in World War II. First of all, in the Manhattan Project, thousands of people around the country, from Oppenheimer down to the guy who swept the floors at Los Alamos, did know generally the point of what they were building was. But the purpose of the project was to win the war and save American lives. A 9/11 advanced knowledge plot would require as an absolute baseline that whoever knew about the impending attack would be absolutely counted upon to act both immorally in deciding with a clear conscience to permit the murder of thousands of their fellow citizens and act against the express interests of the jobs they were doing and the institutions they worked for. And again, a LIHOP plot coming off successfully requires that there not be a single whistleblower, not a single document, not a single clue left by anybody anywhere to attest to the knowledge of the plot. I've already dealt with the August 6, 2001 President's Daily Briefing issue. It doesn't rise to that level, nor anywhere even close. Could the U.S. government have stopped the 9/11 attacks if the various agencies working on potential Al-Qaeda threats had been more competent and cooperative with one another? Yes, there is reason to think so. Does that mean that there was a conscious conspiracy to allow it to happen? No, far from it. The 9/11 conspiracy theories are simply ridiculous. They have nothing, not a single shred of evidence to support them. I'll leave you with one fact that many people don't know. One of the biggest vectors of 9/11 truther theories was a 2005 internet film called Loose Change, made by a 21-year-old amateur filmmaker from upstate New York named Dylan Avery. This film, which went viral even before YouTube was a thing, introduced millions of people to most of the tropes of 9/11 conspiracy theories. The fact about this that many people don't know is that within a few years after the release of the film, and certainly by 2014 when he gave an interview to Vocative magazine, Dylan Avery repudiated the content of Loose Change and said that getting involved with 9/11 conspiracy theories nearly destroyed his life. Of the person he once blamed for doing 9/11, Dylan Avery said, quote, "I don't think Bush could plan a bowl of cereal." So there you have it. The person most directly responsible for spreading conspiracy theories about September 11th to more people than probably any other single person realized within a few years that the conspiracy theories were simply not true. I can't think of a more telling coda to put on this uncomfortable subject, which I'm going to stop talking about right now. Thanks for taking a look at what I'm doing in my Origins of 9/11 class. I had originally planned to do 6 intro videos before the class launches. I decided 4 is plenty, so this will be the last one. Again, if you're interested in signing up, there's a link in the description. Not everyone who gets on the waiting list is guaranteed a seat. When registration opens, it'll be first come, first served, until I reach the registration cap, which will be about 50 or so. Thanks for bearing with me through this lengthy project. Sorry, I did not do a deep dive video for the month of October, but I am working on one for the future. In any event, thank you for joining me on another journey into the past.